phrase was that when he looked objectively at the reality all around him, the rise of fascism across Europe, the defeat of the Russian Revolution, and the decay of the Soviet system into a bureaucratic dictatorship, the spreading and deepening of imperialist domination around the world, it necessitated a certain pessimism. Indeed, the situation was very bleak. But nevertheless, he understood as a Marxist that nothing would last forever and that history always is on the move. That the oppressed were not merely the oppressed were not merely victims of the world, but also have agency to change it in certain ways. That despite the catastrophic conditions of Gramsci's present reality, that there were reasons to believe that a better future was over the horizon. While his intellectual understanding of the present world led him to pessimism, his understanding of the human will to act and to change the course of history was a reason for optimism. In this talk, I'm going to discuss the science of climate change and other ecological crises that don't get discussed as much as climate change, their social and political roots, and what kinds of solutions will be necessary to overcome them. But this tension between optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect will run throughout the talk, and I really hope it's something we can talk more explicitly about in the discussion afterwards, because this really is an existential crisis, and we should talk about it in terms of it being an existential crisis. So on that note, I want to start by discussing the incredible gravity of this topic. The ISO, the National Socialist Organization, we organize a lot of meetings about a lot of very heavy subjects. All forms of brutal, murderous oppression and exploitation, slavery, genocide, rape, needless starvation, imperialist wars, all of the profound viciousness and inhumanity that is spawned by the capitalist system that we can try to wrap our heads around. And all of those topics are very heavy, and they can be overwhelming to think about. But the topic of climate change, I think, is in a league of its own when it comes to its ability to inspire a real visceral and inescapable sense of dread. When we talk about the social brutality that this society has produced up to now, there remains an underlying subliminal thread of hope that runs throughout it. We organize to fight back against racism and sexism and the national chauvinism that targets immigrants and refugees, the exploitation of workers, etc., because we have hope that those things can change. We hope that even if we don't individually live to see those changes come to pass, that at some point, eventually, the tide will turn, and that just as other forms of oppression throughout history have been abolished, the forms of oppression in our own society and in our own moment in history, that those too can be swept into the dustbin of history and a better world can be built. The reason why this topic is different is because when you look at the problem square in the face as objectively as you can, and if you refuse to look away when it starts to hurt, you'll see something that is uniquely agonizing. What you'll see is that this hope that we hold in our core for a better future, this hope that gets us out of bed in the morning and that drives us to aspire to something freer and more beautiful than the world that we encounter today, that this hope is actually fading, and it's fading rapidly. The reality of climate change that hangs like an anvil over our heads at all times threatens to completely destroy everything that we've ever known and loved and everything that we ever could know and love. We all make assumptions about the world, what the world will be like in the future, and those assumptions become the foundation upon which all of our hopes and dreams are built. For meaningful work, for family and community, for peace and social stability, or even just to get by and maintain some semblance of what is already a painful normalcy. The truth is that the interlocking web of ecological catastrophes that are all around us at all times are already rapidly eroding that foundation upon which our hopes stand. This topic is painful, it's excruciatingly painful, because any honest assessment of our ecological situation leads us to conclude that perhaps most of our hopes and dreams have already been taken from us, and that even those who are more knowledgeable and are more worried than the average person may not actually have fully accepted the full weight of what that means. So, lest you think that I'm being unduly bleak or am exaggerating, let me try to convince you that the situation actually is just as serious as I've just described by delving into some of the recent natural history of the Earth's climate, the science of climate change, and its social implications. So some of this, quite a few of you I think will know. Between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, and the global climate stabilized to such a degree that it was possible for human beings to develop farming and produce an agricultural surplus. This is the key condition that is necessary for the emergence of human civilizations. The production of an agricultural surplus meant that more food was produced than what was required for the survival of the individuals whose labor produced the food, the agricultural surplus. And that allows for the emergence of new fields of human labor. If someone doesn't have to work in a field to produce their own means of subsistence, they can pursue things like medicine, math and science, religion, government, building permanent structures in towns, pursuit of new energy sources and metalworking, all the way up to the International Space Station, heart transplants, social, global internet, artificial intelligence, and so on. In other words, everywhere that human civilization has arisen and developed, it was necessarily preceded by the production of a surplus of the materials required for human well-being that allowed for the emergence of complex division of human labor. This is a key point, so I'm going to emphasize it. A stable and temperate climate makes the production of an agricultural surplus possible, which is the bedrock of civilization. Therefore, a climate that makes the sustainable production of an agricultural surplus impossible will necessarily bring about the collapse of global civilization. So we have to ask, is that likely to happen? Is that what is happening to our climate now? I think that it is what's happening to our climate now. Prior to the emergence of industrial civilizations, the concentration of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere was stable around 275 parts per million. According to Dr. James Hansen, former NASA scientist and director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, he says that if we have any chance of survival really at all, we have to, it's absolutely necessary for us to keep our carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million. You may have heard of 350.org, that's where that number comes from, 350 parts per million. Concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, where are we today? According to NASA, the concentration last month was 405.6 parts per million. So we've already gone off the cliff, is what that's telling us. And it's increasing, and it's increasing at an accelerating rate. The concentration of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere today is higher than it has been at any point in at least 20 million years, which is far back as we can reliably measure. And previously to 40 years ago, the highest concentration in that 20 million year window that we can actually see was 387 parts per million 15 million years ago, and we're way above that. So, and even at that level, the Earth was hotter than it is today by about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and sea levels were between 75 and 120 feet higher. So in other words, if you look solely at carbon dioxide levels, we're clearly in completely uncharted territory and very, very far outside of the conditions that created a climate stable and temperate enough for human civilizations to emerge in the first place. And that's only looking at carbon dioxide. But the picture is actually much more complicated and even scarier than that. The global geological systems at play are complex, and they're full of feedback loops that can rapidly shift in completely nonlinear ways, meaning the pace of change can itself change very rapidly. Above 2 degrees Celsius warming, and we're currently, with the carbon dioxide that we've already emitted, we're currently committed to 1.7 degrees. We're already at 1 degree now. But above 2 degrees, the heating begins to kick in a whole array of feedback loops that makes the problem much, much worse. An avalanche will be unleashed that becomes completely out of our control and will be completely unprecedented in the history of our species. And actually even longer than that. So for example, this summer could be the first year in 3 million years that there might not be any ice in the Arctic. And if it's not this year, it will probably be another year in the very near future. And when all of the sea ice melts, a giant ice surface turns into a giant dark absorptive surface. Where there was once a mirror to reflect the sun's energy back into space, there's now a giant solar collector holding on to it. So you can see there's feedback. It gets warm, and it creates it makes space for even more warming. So the Arctic is actually heating a lot more quickly than the rest of the planet. And to make matters worse, according to Dr. Peter Wadhams, who's a professor of ocean physics at Cambridge University in the UK, Under the Arctic sea ice, I mean, this much is not controversial. Under the Arctic sea ice is embedded about 50 gigatons of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that causes at least 100 times as much warming as carbon dioxide, and on a much shorter time scale. So once the sea ice is gone and the Arctic Ocean warms, that methane can start to be released extremely rapidly in perhaps as little as 10 to 50 years. And there's some controversy there, there's some debate among ocean physicists, people who study these methane cleth rates in the Arctic, but there are fairly mainstream people who are saying, like, within 10 years we could have a 50 gigaton release of methane. And then in that event, an additional 0.6 degrees Celsius warming could happen within just a few decades, which would be completely catastrophic. Because again, if we're already committed to 1.7% or 1.7 degrees, if we stopped emitting today, we would already have a 1.7 degree Celsius increase. If that 0.6 degrees went, we were way over 2. So keep in mind that the current international UN agreement to fight climate change, the Paris Agreement, shoots to hold global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius to avoid these catastrophic feedback loops. But even at 2 degrees, there's already a horrifyingly high probability that this scenario will play out anyway. But that's just the figure that has basically been settled on by the ruling classes of the barbaric capitalist countries who are willing to gamble with the future of the entire species to protect their profits. Furthermore, there are other ecological catastrophes that are different but related to climate change that we almost never talk about but really deserve our attention as well. So in 2009, there was a team of 28 internationally renowned scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Center who developed an analysis of 9, they call them planetary boundaries, outside of which the planet becomes essentially inhospitable to human life in relatively short time frames. That analysis, which has become fairly influential, was updated in 2015 by 18 scientists also at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and that was published in the academic journal Science, which is one of the top 3 most prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journals in the world, with the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Nature. So these quantitative boundaries include climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, disruption of the biogeochemical cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, global fresh water use, change in land use, biodiversity loss, atmospheric aerosol loading, and chemical pollution. I really recommend that people look for these papers. Go check out the Stockholm Resilience Center and look at these papers about these planetary boundaries, because they're all based on like very sound science, but they communicate kind of what we need to do in order to survive as a species pretty clearly. Of those 9 planetary boundaries, we are already outside 3 of them. Climate change, of course, but also disruption of the nitrogen cycle and biodiversity loss through extinction. And by the way, human activity has already triggered the largest mass extinction since the KT mass extinction event 66 million years ago. Climate change, ocean acidification, and stratospheric ozone depletion all include tipping points, because they're complex systems, beyond which, if they're ever surpassed, we can never return. So that's the 2 degrees C. Once you get past 2 degrees C, it kicks in all of these other feedback mechanisms, and you can't go back. It's an avalanche, like I said. And we're extremely close, if not already beyond the tipping point for climate change. So I could go on and on and on about the science, and I'm happy to do so in the discussion if that's what people are interested in discussing. But at its core, these ecological catastrophes are part of a more general social and political crisis. The origins of the ecological crisis are social, and its possible solutions are also social. There are scientific and technical obstacles, to be sure, but those obstacles cannot be overcome until the bigger, more fundamental social obstacles are dealt with. So when I say that climate change and all of these compounding ecological crises have social roots, what I really mean is that they have capitalist roots. And what I mean by capitalism, I'll talk about capitalism for a second. What I mean by capitalism is the economic, social, and political system in which all human activity is to a lesser or greater degree directed... Left word. What I mean by capitalism is an economic, social, and political system in which all human activity is to a lesser or greater degree directed around the production of monetary profits for owners of capital, i.e. capitalists. Under this economic system, the tools and resources that are used to produce the things that we need and want are privately owned. So the tools and materials are used by workers to produce new things in the form of commodities, which is basically anything that is produced for buying and selling. And when those commodities are sold on the market, the revenues from selling the commodities belong to the private owners of the economic institutions, who use part of those revenues, but not all of it, to pay workers in the form of wages. The part that is not paid to workers is profit. This profit is value that was created by workers but belongs to the employers, according to capitalist property relations. And the private owners of economic capital, who most frequently did nothing to produce the value but simply owned businesses or stocks and other financial assets, so those are the people who all the profits belong to. Because nearly all economic activity under capitalism takes the shape of commodity production, again, things that are bought and sold, individual capitalists have to compete to sell their commodities on the market. So they're fighting with each other, and they're trying to undercut each other with prices and advertising and all the rest. And the capitalists who generate the most profit will have the most resources to outcompete other producers, therefore laying the groundwork for yet more profits. Profits beget more profits, and the capitalist who is the most brutal, the most competitive, the most destructive, and the most exploitative will win the biggest profits. Individual capitalists understand their shared class interests as the ruling class within a capitalist society, and they create governments and other institutions, the state, to maintain their social domination over all other classes. Through a million different channels, they subvert any and all democratic checks on their power, on their class power as the capitalist class. They control governments and they destroy the ones who resist them. They promote racism, sexism, and all other forms of oppressive ideas and behavior among the workers to divide and conquer them, to prevent any sort of united working class resistance to the social system of capitalism. They flood the ideological apparatuses of society, like the schools, the media, the religious institutions, and so on, with propaganda that justifies the domination of profits over all other aspects of human life. For example, the infamous Koch brothers, who are some of the most powerful fossil fuel capitalists in the world, use some of their billions of dollars to run a foundation that funds conservative ideological interventions at universities all over the country, which includes the George Washington Forum here at Ohio University. So anytime you go to a George Washington event, you can know that it's funded by the Koch brothers, fossil fuel billionaires, who are paying them to indoctrinate people with ideas about how the world is really great and we should keep it fundamentally the way it is. Furthermore, all the capitalists in a single imperialist nation or sector band together through national governments to protect their collective profits against those of other capitalists in other imperialist nations. And they build imperialist militaries to brutally enforce their domination over the whole world and to compete militarily to determine which empire gets to exploit which people and which resources. And again, they rely heavily on ideological control of the general population to carry out their tyrannical imperialist pursuit of profits and to diminish the resistance. For example, the US military, the Pentagon, pays the NFL $80 million a year to have the national anthem performed before every football game and to ensure that it's televised. And why is that? They do that so that when Trump bombs Afghanistan with the largest non-nuclear bomb in the world, which he did today, as a bargaining chip to intimidate China vis-a-vis their whole negotiations over North Korea, millions of people will chant USA instead of asking why $314 million was not spent on education and healthcare, but instead was spent on a bomb to kill a bunch of poor people in Afghanistan. So I could talk about the evils of capitalism I do it all the time. So I could go on and on about it. But the important thing for the purpose of this discussion is that under the capitalist system, all economic activity, and to some degree all social activity in general, must be carried out to maximize short-term profits. Profits are the lifeblood of the capitalist system, and nothing can get in the way of making profits. not human well-being, and not even the survival of the planet. As the Russian revolutionary V.I. Lenin said, quote, "A capitalist will even sell you the rope with which to hang him." And this is not just because capitalists are stupid or evil or greedy. They are stupid and evil and greedy, but it's actually besides the point. It's not about the moral failings of some rich individuals. The capitalist system, as a system, requires constantly expanding profits, or else it goes into a tailspin, causes massive job losses, destroys the living standards of working class people to restore their profit rates. They spark wars, or whatever else it takes to restore their profitability. The need to put production of profits before all else is an inherent feature of capitalism as a system, and not just a fleeting feature of particularly immoral individuals. One example of the continuing existence of famines. One example of this is the continuing existence of famines. So it's expected, some of you may have heard about this, it's expected that 20 million people are going to die this summer of starvation in 7 countries in North Africa and Yemen. At the same time as 20 million people are starving to death, there is a global overproduction of grain to the point that there's actually a crisis in our capacity to store it. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, last year was the 3rd year in a row with historically high grain surpluses. There's enough grain in storage just in the United States to feed the entire country of China, the world's largest, the most populous country in the world with over 1 billion people, for a year in storage, waiting to be sold in the United States alone. And yet 20 million people are going to die of starvation. There's so much in storage that some farmers are leaving, basically creating giant concrete pads and leaving their excess, their surplus grain just in a pile on these giant concrete pads and covering with a tarp and hoping that not too much of it goes to waste or gets eaten by, animals. And yet 20 million people are going to starve to death. Because it would not be profitable to just give a small portion of what U.S. corporations are just storing because they can't profitably sell it. We couldn't just give it to people who are starving to death because, well, that would hurt profits, and nothing comes above profits. Yesterday I actually read an interview with a farmer in the United States in which the interviewer asked, so why don't you just not grow anything this year and just sell off your massive surplus? You can live on just selling off your surplus, and it would diminish the overall glut, and prices would go back and restore profitability. And his response was, I have a loan at the bank to pay off, so I can't do anything less. The whole world revolves around profit. So capitalism is a completely irrational system from the perspective of meeting human needs, and it's driven by the relentless pursuit of profit, no matter the implications for human well-being or survival. And when it comes down to it, burning fossil fuels is just too damn profitable. As things stand, the mainstream scientific consensus is that we can emit roughly 335 more gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions before definitely going over the climate change tipping point of 2 degrees Celsius, beyond which the complex feedback mechanisms I talked about before would likely lead to a rapid, catastrophic collapse of global civilization, probably within the lifespan of a baby who is born today. So 335 gigatons, remember that number. So we're 335 gigatons of carbon dioxide away from hitting a brick wall. And we're moving at a speed of about 10 gigatons per year, and we're pressing on the accelerator. At this point, basically your heart should be falling into your stomach because this is very, very bad, and it actually gets worse. Fossil fuel companies, private, publicly traded, and state-owned, have already invested more than $6 trillion. $6 trillion, that's like 1/3 of the US GDP. In fossil fuel reserves, which amount to 2,755 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. That is to say, Bill McKibben, who some people may know, is a very famous environmentalist and journalist, wrote an article back in 2012 in Rolling Stone magazine called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, and he basically uses the same logic. I'm copying his logic just with updated numbers, basically. So that is all to say that the fossil fuel industry, which is perhaps the most powerful capitalist industry in the world, already has built into its investments already has built into its business plans to emit almost 9 times as much greenhouse gases than what we can afford to do without bringing about a full-blown collapse of civilization. So the implication is pretty clear. To even make the most basic steps toward maintaining a livable planet for human life, and almost all other forms of life on the planet for that matter, the capitalist system will have to take a historically unprecedented blow. Trillions of dollars in global fossil fuel infrastructure will have to be abandoned without a dime of profit. So basically the most evil people in the world are just going to give up trillions of dollars. That's what we're relying on. The ensuing economic crisis, if that were to happen, let's just say it happened somehow, the ensuing economic crisis would create a global financial chaos if $6 trillion of investment just disappeared. So it's likely they would actually bring about the collapse of capitalism all on its own, even without a revolution, and just nothing better would replace it. And the only way for them to restore profits is to actually brutally exploit people all over the world and destroy their standards of living. Again, because they can pay people, if the standard of living is lower, they can pay people less, and they can restore their profits basically by balancing, or by doing it on the back of workers. The intensification of competition between imperialist powers, because again, imperialism is basically driven by capitalist nations fighting each other over who gets to control which sources of revenue, which sources of profit. The intensification of competition between the imperialist powers, for the very survival actually, could easily produce genocides and world wars on a scale that would easily match or even surpass those of the previous 2 world wars. Borders will become heavily militarized, as they already are. Scarce resources and economic opportunities begin to pit people against each other, as they basically compete for whatever scraps are available. All forms of social oppression, racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, xenophobia, and so on, will all be intensified. If capitalism does not create a global catastrophe and destroy the lives of almost all living people by destroying itself along with the planet, well then it will do those things by surviving, because it will have to do them in order to survive. To further demonstrate this point about what must happen to avoid this scenario, there was a paper that was published recently, actually like 3 weeks ago, in the academic journal Science, which I alluded to earlier. And the paper was entitled "A Roadmap for Rapid Decarbonization." So in this paper, the authors developed a hypothetical plan to demonstrate what are the kind and scale of interventions that would need to be made in order to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius in accordance with the UN Paris Agreement. Their plan, this hypothetical plan that they're proposing, and it's basically just to they're just making a point basically about just kind of the scale of things that would need to happen. Their plan relies on global emissions being cut in half every decade, starting immediately. That is, we would have to cut our emissions by 50% before 2027. We'll also have to start immediately investing in carbon capture and sequestration technologies that don't even exist yet, and we're going to have to implement them on a scale that is far beyond what we even have the technical capacity to do. This would be extremely expensive, and it's not going to turn 1 penny of profit for any capitalist. And they don't do things they don't even feed people to prevent them from starving to death if it doesn't make them profit. We have to implement massively disruptive land use reforms on an international scale, which is also going to eat into the profits of corporations who currently make a lot of money by tearing down the rainforest and destroying the topsoil through industrial monoculture. So the conclusion, I think, should be pretty crystal clear. Capitalism will destroy the planet and all of us on it if we do not first destroy capitalism. The kinds of interventions that are urgently needed will require incredibly costly measures that will destroy profits and not grow them. They will require international cooperation on a historically unprecedented scale, something that is not possible when nations are locked into imperialist competition over military control of profit sources. These interventions will need to acquire an international reach while maintaining sensitivity to local needs and particularities, which can only be accomplished via the most thorough democratic means. In summary, saving the world will require immense international cooperation, the most thoroughgoing democratic control of the economy, and the total and complete abolition of the profit motive. In other words, it will require a socialist revolution. So now probably some of you are thinking that this is a naive proposition, that we're nowhere even close to the world historic overthrow of the international capitalist system, and even further from the establishment of international socialism. You might think that I'm being totally unrealistic, but I would ask you, what is more realistic? The revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of socialism, or the survival of human civilization without the overthrow of capitalism? I don't propose that the solution of that a social revolution, I don't pose that solution lightly. Let alone to propose that it has to happen very soon. I don't propose that such a project will be easy, or even, frankly, that it's possible within the short time frame that we actually have left to act. I hope that it is. I'm not confident that it is. I'm only asserting that it will be necessary for our survival. Not that it's even desirable or that it's likely, but simply that it's necessary. So before I wrap up, I want to come back to the point about optimism and pessimism. If we're going to build the sort of social revolutionary movement that will be required to correct our course and to survive, to see what else history might have in store for our species, we're going to need to be guided by Gramsci's position of being a, quote, optimist of the intellect but an optimist of the will. Pessimist of the intellect and optimist of the will. As I said before, to look at the problems of our looming ecological catastrophe square in the face and to not look away is excruciatingly painful, and that it must instill, if you take it seriously, it must instill a very deep pessimism. And yet, and though it is fading, and it is fading quickly, hope does remain, but only if we accept the revolutionary implications of what the planet is telling us, and only if we're willing to embrace the dangerous tasks of what will be required of us. As some of you know, some of you who know me personally can attest, I frequently have been temporarily paralyzed, basically, by the fear of what stands before us. But in those moments, I look to those in the past who have faced seemingly impossible odds and yet somehow managed to do what needed to be done. One such person, for me, from whom I draw inspiration, is the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. After being sent into exile by the Stalinist dictatorship in the Soviet Union, that Trotsky himself played a leading role, in fact, in establishing, Trotsky wrote in his diary from exile, "Life is not an easy matter. You cannot go through it without falling into frustration, cynicism, and despair unless you have before you a great idea which raises you above all personal misery, above weakness, and above all kinds of perfidy and baseness." End quote. Personally, I can think of no other cause, no other great idea more worthy of my struggles, my frustration, my misery, and my life's commitment than to the cause of the revolutionary redemption of this civilization from the abyss into which it is rapidly falling, and I hope that you will draw that conclusion as well.